right, welcome everyone to Columbia Business School's Distinguished Speaker Series with Mike Intrator, CEO and co-founder of CoreWeave, in conversation with Tamer Maglaras. Early in his tenure, Tamer Maglaras focused on two global trends that he determined Columbia Business School must lead on, and those are AI and climate change, for the simple reason that those two trends will affect every business everywhere in the many decades ahead. Today's guest, Mike Intrator, is uniquely positioned to discuss both of those topics. I first met Mike over 20 years ago when we were both working at the intersection of finance and climate change. Mike, a Columbia University graduate, worked part-time at Columbia Business School while completing his degree, and he wrote a senior thesis on using nuclear power to address climate change. He also helped create, after graduation, one of the first climate investment funds in the world, which financed mitigation projects in China and other countries, where he honed skills in infrastructure development that are pretty useful today. Mike co-founded CoreWeave in 2017. The company went public in March in the largest AI-related listing. Since the IPO, the stock has tripled, and today its market cap is $66 billion. Throughout his career, Mike has clearly been ahead of the curve on both climate change and AI. Please join me in welcoming Mike Intrator to Columbia Business School.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mike, for coming. So we'll talk about CoreWeave. We'll talk a little bit about AI. We'll talk about climate and energy. But I want to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your company. You've built a company that now has positioned itself as sort of a huge provider of AI infrastructure, competing with some of these hyperscalers, as we call it. You're the new kid on the block that now is like a huge company in its own right. You can tell us a little bit about that journey?
Sure. First of all, Bruce, thank you for the introduction. That was great. As Bruce said, I've known Bruce for a long time. We've spent a lot of time in the early days of our careers kind of working through some really complicated and interesting and I would argue really important questions around climate change. It has been truly my privilege, and I think of it as a privilege to have spent and will continue to spend my career working on what I believe to be the two issues of our time, which is climate change and artificial intelligence. I think they're seismic in nature and have the ability to really bend the trajectory of the world. And so it has been a privilege to work on these two things, and I feel very fortunate that I've managed to put myself, with the help of an amazing, amazing group of people, in a position to work at a company and to build a company like CoreWeave that has done some truly unbelievable things. It's been a lot of fun, and I'll talk a little bit about the company now. So CoreWeave, the way we think about it is it's the AI hyperscaler. It's the force multiplier for people working on artificial intelligence. And what we have built is the first AI native cloud. And when we started the company, we really started the company in crypto. We were running a Hudson Ridge Asset Management, which was a hedge fund that was a systematic, algorithmic, fundamentally driven natural gas fund, right? So basically all those big words mean is we were scraping the internet for big data around natural gas flows in the US pipe system, and looking at consumption and weather patterns to drive signals for buy and sell. And so that's a little bit of the tech piece of it. That Yeah, but when you build an algorithmic system, one of the things that happens is you build it and then it's built, and you kind of run it and test new things and watch how it works and make sure it doesn't blow up the world and that kind of stuff, right? And you're basically monitoring the system, and which gives you a lot of time to think about other things. And we started to think about crypto, and crypto's fascinating, right? It's just like a fascinating concept. We're curious and nerdy and all those kind of things. And so we got interested in crypto and then got interested in the security layer in particular, and then started to play around with it. We looked at Bitcoin and thought it was a terrible idea from a security layer perspective, because at the end of the day, there was some brilliant engineer in China that had built the ASIC machine, and I just assumed they built it. They're probably better at running it than I am. And so I didn't really see that I brought a lot to the table there. But the GPUs, those were really interesting because GPUs you can do a lot of different things with, and we knew that from the start. And the way, the lens that I look at the world with really was built in the early days, kind of growing up with Bruce and Jack and all these other guys that focused on this stuff. But like my lens was incredibly quantitative in nature and like hyper rational and focused on the concept of optionality and flexibility, right? Like that's the key things that I look for when I am kind of exploring things, because I just think that's, flexibility is where things get interesting. And so, the GPU had all of this ability to kind of reorient itself, and we had no idea what we were doing when we started the business. That was the beginning of Atlantic Crypto, which ultimately became CoreWeave that everybody knows. What the mission of the company is to kind of rethink the way that the cloud needs to work for a new generation of computing, right? Like it stands to reason that when, three of you will come out of this auditorium, hook up, build a company, and become the third largest consumer of computational power in the world in 6 months, that the requirements of the cloud need to be different, right? And the cloud went through this very, very fundamental change that people to varying degrees understand or don't, which was moving from sequential computing to parallelized computing. And it was kind of the genesis of what we went about building, right? We built a company that does three things, right? And the first one was to build a company that had a beautiful, elegant, technical solution to a problem. And that problem was, how do you serve compute to the world that is going to require size and scale of parallelized computing that sort of defies human imagination, right? And so that was the first piece of it. And what we did, it's very hard to say that you have an advantage over Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, right? And there is an audacity, a hubris, insanity perhaps, of trying to take on that part of the market. But be that as it may,
But you did.
But we did, and we did, and I don't like. Once again, we think about it's like myself and Brian and Brandon. Like it's just everything is about like risk and exposure, and so like you had the confluence of this new type of cloud computing with this new world-changing technology that required an entirely different approach to infrastructure and an entirely different approach to finance. And it was only because of the confluence of those 3 or 4 different like enormous, each one of those enormous moving pieces happening simultaneously that allowed for the dislocation that occurred. Like it couldn't be done otherwise. And we saw that, right? Like we saw the abject dominance of the hyperscalers within the cloud space through the CPU era. right? Like, and there's reasons for that, right? Like once they are able to achieve a systemically lower cost of capital, we have seen those cloud computing giants crush competition based on that one sole advantage. It has nothing to do with the quality. But that only works in a world that moves incrementally. In a world that moves in step functions, that advantage doesn't hold, right? And if we think about it through history, there's all these times where things just change. And when things change in a large enough way, there is the opportunity for disruption. And so we went from sequential computing, think of that as the cloud that supports data lakes and it supports websites and your mom keeps her photos on it and all that kind of stuff, right? And it is a beautiful, fantastic solution to that problem. But when you move from that environment to parallelized computing, you've changed some of the fundamental assumptions in what the cloud has to do and how it does it. And it turns out that the things that made the legacy cloud great at what it did actually are negatives in serving the new type of computing, right? The hypervisor, which is the piece of software that just does this incredible job of the last mile of computing, right? Like if something breaks when you're using a CPU-based cloud, you never know it, right? Because it just goes out and grabs a new, virtually just grabs a new CPU, slaps it in there, and you would never even know that anything broke. But that doesn't work in the parallelized world.
Can I stop you for a second? Because I think it would be interesting for you to visualize for the crowd. When you build out a new data center that in some sense can be configured to work as one computer.
Yep.
Tell this crowd, how big is that computer? In physical size, in needs, because these things that, I've seen some of them, they're daunting.
Yeah.
And you actually specialize in that field.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about it.
So like, it's like the Death Star, right?
But in a good way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sort of joking and sort of not, right? Like initially it was a single Death Star, and now what's happening is what we're working on is, when I say we, I mean the entire space is configuring so that you can bring in multiple facilities of this enormous scale and have them work in concert. And so it started out with a cluster of a few thousand GPUs, and think of that as a couple computing racks, whatever. And then it turned into football fields, and then it turned into multiple football fields. And it's just like, it is wild. It is just, it is really amazing, the scale of these things.
And I think what's important for the audience to understand is that when what Mike is describing is a football field or 4 football fields that are connected when they're actually working, so that from the point of view of the user, they're one computer. Okay, so you have sort of hundreds of thousands of GPUs that are themselves parallelized machines. So they're doing, hundreds of thousands of parallel calculations, each of them simultaneously, and they're all working on the same problem simultaneously.
Yeah.
And that is an incredible, and in some sense, to go back to your crypto origins, crypto mining was in some sense a GPU exercise, because it was, so you found yourself, I'm imagining right now, but you found yourself with a much more pure play infrastructure that was GPU based, rather than the hyperscalers that they may have had 10% GPUs, 90% CPUs, and data server racks that we used to sort of rent out to do compute, but different type of compute back in the day. But you mentioned that you had, as a result, different architecture in your data center. That then when you took your data center and you made it 10, 100, 1,000 times bigger, that architecture was actually much more efficient for the pure play AI.
Yeah,
what's going on?
the software that we built, that solution allows you to understand what's going on in this computer that takes up multiple football fields in a way that the hyperscalers just couldn't, right? You'd have a problem with hyperscalers and you'd have to send them a what just happened, and 2 weeks later they'd come back with it. Whereas the way that we built it, you would get real-time feedback to your dashboard and know what broke or why it broke, or if it was going to break, can we cordon it off before it breaks? And the problem with it is when you run a data center as a computer, as an AI factory, as Jensen will speak to it. The problem is when one GPU breaks or one connection flaps, the entire data center goes down. And as you guys have all been watching, the numbers, the cost of these things is just kind of astronomical. And so losing an hour on one of these machines is losing an hour on a $40 billion piece of machinery. That's expensive.
Do you think that this sort of moat that you had initially is a defensible moat when you think about the next 3 to 5 years and the hyperscalers and what they're doing?
So I think of the moat, as I think of most things in this space, is it evolves, right? And so when we're launching the company, the moat is we have a better piece of cloud. And I believe fundamentally that all of the neoclouds and all of the hyperscalers will ultimately wind up building the cloud that they use to serve AI in an architecture that is similar to the architecture that we built. And to give you an idea of how unique the architecture is, the way our relationship with Jensen began is, we went over there and we sat in their spaceship office, whatever they call it, and they just kind of brought in, they wanted to know what we were up to, and so they brought in like junior level people, and they just kind of kept bringing in more and more senior level people, and we topped out at like Jay Purry, who's sort of the COO, and Ian Buck, who is one of the guys who kind of wrote CUDA, the CTO kind of. And that was it. We went home and we were just like, that was weird. And month goes by, we didn't hear anything, and then we get a call from our representative, and he says, Jensen wants you on the phone in 15 minutes, which is like a perfectly Jensen thing, right? Like no time to prepare. You're just like, standing there. This is like, your nightmare of, waking up naked in the middle of a classroom or something, right? Like it's just like, you're just he doesn't want any packaging. And so 15 minutes, we get on the phone with him, and it was supposed to be a half-hour call, and he spent 45 minutes bearing down on Brian on the architecture. Why are you building it this way? How does that benefit my clients? How is that going to make the infrastructure work better? Why didn't you go this way? Why didn't you do that? It was unbelievable. Like his mastery of the concepts were incredible. And then like Eye of Sauron kind of moment here, he just turns to me, and I did not say a word in the technical discussion. There was no reason to expose myself to that. And he just turned to me, and then for 45 minutes just ripped into me. How are you going to raise the money? Why do you think you can finance this? How do you manage credit for startups? How do you do this? How do you do that? Are you going to be able to expand? How are you going to get the data centers to give you capacity when you have no credit?
When was that?
That was 2.5 years ago. I don't know. I suffer from time blindness to begin with, and things have been moving pretty fast. So, yeah, it was when the way that the call ended, and so there was 5 of us actually on the call. The sales guy, who I'm pretty sure was hiding under his desk the entire time, and then myself and Brian, who was my partner, one of the 3 founders, and Jay Purry and Jensen. And at the end of that hour and a half call, he just turned to Jay and said, tell Vishal we're going to invest in these guys. These guys are building the cloud the way I need it to be built. This is the vision of how it's supposed to work. And so like the technical differentiation was enormous, right? Like that was the first place we started. The physical ability to deliver infrastructure, this stuff is super physical. Like you got to build a data center, you got to deal with the cooling, you got to deal with an untold amount of power moving through these systems, and to build an organization that's capable of doing that at velocity and at scale. And those are two concepts that I hold the company to at all times, right? It's, scale decommoditizes compute, right? Getting another GPU doesn't help anybody. Building a cluster that's large enough to train the most important models in the world is no longer a commodity. That is a solution. And then the third area that we focus on is finance, right? And we have been so incredibly, we have been just the tip of the spear thinking about how you go about building a company like this. How do you access the capital markets? And I always joke. I was like, when we started this business, you go out to Silicon Valley and you go out there and you say, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And first they look at you like you're crazy because who takes on the hyperscalers? And then they look at you like, and even if it was a good idea, we've been investing in software and that's not really capital intensive. And that's how we've made the last $1 trillion. So we're not investing in you. And that was disheartening. But to build infrastructure, whether it's the railroads or the power grid, or power generation or fuel exploration or whatever infrastructure you want, at the end of the day, it doesn't happen in the equity markets. And we understood that. Our project finance DNA understood that. And what we did is we looked at the way, we plugged into both markets, right? In West Coast, let's go change the world. And finally got some traction there. And then East Coast capital, which I always say has only one rule, which is do not lose my fucking money. That's it, right? That's the only rule that they play by. And
That's the scientific term.
That is the side. There may be more eloquent ways, but there's certainly not more accurate ways. Like on the finance side, we have been pushing that forward, and even through the IPO, which we IPO'd 3 days before Liberation Day into the tariffs under the direct advice from the investment bankers. You cannot do this. You cannot do this. You cannot do this. To which I responded, that's cool. Why don't you guys step out? You got 20 minutes. Come back in with a better answer because we're going public tomorrow. And I believed fundamentally that the bankers worrying about their franchise, worrying about the capital, none of that mattered. What mattered was us becoming a public company, because this company is the definition of what needs to be in the public market. It needs to be able to access the most inexpensive, largest, deepest pools of capital to build infrastructure on a planetary scale. And they didn't understand that.
Let me ask you a question about that. So we are now sort of we're finishing a 3 to 5 year period of massive build out. And you and I were chatting a little bit before we started, and we're talking about training models, inference, and how these things are actually changing. What do you see over the next 3 to 5 years? And we'll ping pong a little bit.
Most important trend, and I would argue maybe the most important trend right now in the world, is the adoption of inference. Inference is the monetization of artificial intelligence. It's the translation of all of this investment into economic return. It is efficiency, it's deflationary, it is where I go to understand that the investments that are flowing into this market are not insane, right? Because when you see companies using the models to solve real economic problems that will generate massive productivity gains, that's why this works. And so if you don't see inference, that's bad. If you do see inference and you see it accelerating and you see it broadening in its use cases, that is the primary indication of where artificial intelligence will be over the next 5 to 7 years.
Also becoming more cost and energy efficient,
Yeah,
which
so
is important.
yeah, so the strides that have been made, like we think about sustainability in two ways, right? We think about sustainability from the perspective of sustainability is near and dear to my heart. It's where I started my career. It's what I was focused on. I thought it was important then. I think it's important now. We are seeing unbelievable improvements in the efficiency from the technology, from a computational power, right? It is faster, it's more energy efficient. The cooling is moved from air to liquid, which has caused like a 60% decrease in energy. Like the strides that are being made are phenomenal. They truly are. And that's one piece of it. Yet the total energy being consumed is obviously roofing. And, we think about that in as holistically a way as possible, because this infrastructure, the data centers that we're building, the energy that's being provided to them, that's not a, one-term or two-term presidential problem. This is a, you're making investments in infrastructure that will survive for, 20, 40 years. And the question, depending upon which piece of it you're talking about, and you need to really think about that from a environmental perspective and a sustainability perspective and a financial viability perspective, because as the issues of sustainability become more important over time or less important over time, that will impact the viability of different pieces of the very, very, very expensive infrastructure building. And so, we just announced in the UK another £1.5 billion investment into the data centers up in Scotland, which is 100% renewable. We're definitely incredibly focused on it to the extent that the grids can handle it.
Can you mentioned UK and then you mentioned Scotland. Can you tell us a little bit about your geographic play?
Yeah. So going back to my background again, right? I ran NatSource Asset Management, probably the largest pool of private capital focused on climate change in the early 2000s. Sometimes I say things that may not be exactly correct, but they're certainly directionally correct. Let's take the win. And so when I was doing that, I was working on projects in China. And that was, you go to those big chemical plants and you can make unbelievable impact on emissions by tackling some of those really, really large facilities with catalysts or incinerators or whatever. I am going to tie this back to our geographic. So let me go the other way. We're largely in the U.S., right? We've got 32, 35 data centers in the U.S., expanding very, very rapidly here. We are expanding in the U.K., Spain, up through the Nordics to support Northern Europe, Germany, that kind of stuff. We have aspirations of building infrastructure globally, which means that we will have to make real inroads in the Middle East and throughout Asia, which is multiple markets, obviously, and as well as South America. And so, that's the plan, that's the board. However, I don't feel like I have the skill set to single-handedly build that. And so to continue to expand into the Middle East, into Asia, into South America, that's going to be through finding the right partners and working with them as we continue to build and expand. We've done that to certain extents on certain skill sets, even within the US. So we own a piece of a data center provider where we're building. I don't know how to build these things, so let's go find somebody that we can work with that can help us kind of absorb those skill sets and kind of allow us to do what we do really well. And so That's the broader strategy. So we're across the U.S., Canada. We're really accelerating within Europe, but we're currently we don't go beyond that.
I want to talk a little bit about the market and how it is, but before that, you talked about monetization by going into the inference, and you and I were chatting a little bit before, and we were talking a little bit about which company is going to reach having $10 billion worth of AI revenue first, and I used to say Microsoft about a year ago, but you're getting close to that.
Yeah.
OpenAI is getting close to that. What's going on in that space? Because that, in some sense, AI stocks have gone through the roof.
Yeah.
And there are some signals in the market that are sort of interesting, and we're going to return to that in a bit.
Sure.
But in some sense, the revenues are now starting to grow.
Yeah.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I was being interviewed the other day on CNBC, and I think David Faber was yelling at me about a bubble. And my comment to him was, look, just because a lot of money is flowing to a particular portion of the market doesn't imply that there's a bubble, right? When companies like Microsoft are building infrastructure so that they can serve artificial intelligence to their clients, that's not a bubble, right? That's just a demand signal that does not have the infrastructure to supply in the computing power to monetize that opportunity. And what I think you're seeing within the lab space, where, like I said, some of these unbelievable numbers are flying around like they're no big thing, but they are. Trust me. $1 billion requires a lot of work to bring online, and so you see these enormous numbers, and you just think about the scale of the actual physical build is enormous. But these companies are seeing unbelievable demand for their products, and that is driving the investment. And yeah, there's not. I don't think the world is doing a great job dealing with the temporal component of this problem, right? And so I'm going to jump ahead to one of the questions you asked me, which was, the circularity that people have been starting to point to within, some of the players, OpenAI,
Oracle, NVIDIA,
CoreWeave, right? So, I get it, but I would encourage you guys to think about this differently, right? You've got the fastest adoption of a technology, and I would imagine that many of you know more about the actual ways in which the technology is going to be used over the next 3 to 5 years than I do, right? I've got a set of problems that I'm working on every day. You guys are probably a little bit more zoomed out, which gives you more breadth to look at this stuff than I have. But we don't have to pay this back in the immediate sense, right? That's what the people that are making these investments understand. It's where do we sit in the ecosystem, and how much time does it take us to be able to earn a return on the investments that we're making? And $1 trillion invested into compute is an outrageous amount of money, unless you think about it as this is something that we have to pay off over the next 20 years, right? And this will be the defining technology that will drive productivity growth of 15% for 10 years. When you start to put it into that perspective, it changes everything. I was sitting in a meeting yesterday, a couple of days ago. It was over the weekend, and there was another founder, very famous founder, who was concerned about unemployment. And I went and talked to him afterwards, and I was just like, what the unemployment problem, from my seat, it's a disruption problem, right? Because people are going to struggle to get repurposed into jobs retrained.
Quickly,
Yeah,
but over time, right?
but like the flip side of it is, and I said, I think your approach to this doesn't take into account what will happen when the economy accelerates by 15%. Like, what does that do? Yeah, so there are, you're going to lose jobs, but you're going to have what happens in America when you take 20% of the population and move their spending up by one standard deviation? How many more jobs does that create? Now, it's a timing problem, and I'm not being flip about it. I understand how incredibly disruptive this is going to be, and there's going to have to be solutions around this stuff. But in the end, I believe that what you have is an acceleration of the economy. With the acceleration of the economy, you have new jobs, perhaps even fewer jobs, but more volume of them to support more activity.
I want to go back to that circular comment because you gave me a sort of an interesting take a few minutes ago. So, we're reading news in the newspapers where NVIDIA was the last one to come out and say they're going to invest $100 billion in OpenAI to basically build out data centers that, in some sense, are there to buy NVIDIA chips or something like that. And so there is a little bit of a circularity in that argument, and the question is that a problem? And you have an explanation as to the capital and what's required right now, and I thought it was compelling. So
sorry, I kind of lost the plot a little bit there when I was given that answer. At the end of the day, the way that I think about it is, if we think about the arc of artificial intelligence, right? It started out within the universities, and
yes,
there were
There
were a bunch of researchers doing incredible work, and it became, it moved beyond that, and then it entered into this period where a couple of venture guys picked it up, but very quickly it got beyond that because they have a capital problem. They're not really built to do that, and then it moved to growth, and that kind of failed, and then it hopped over to where you went to the balance sheets of the largest companies in the world, Microsoft, and that was the OpenAI Microsoft deal, and then I got a hold of it with my guys, and we went ahead and said, that's not going to work, right? Because Microsoft can invest what I thought were the numbers, right? I was like, well, they can invest $100 billion for a couple of years, but they can't invest $300 billion for 10 years, right? That'll blow up their balance sheet. It'll destroy their credit rating. That's not possible. So the only way to finance this is to go to the capital markets where you can deconstruct the financing so that different people can take on different exposures that are appropriate for their risk profile, so forth and so on. And now we're in a world where we've gotten through that, and that's a tool, but there's only really 3, maybe 4 balance sheets on the planet that can support this anymore because it is so large, right? And so what are the balance sheets that can support this? US government, it's Chinese government, it's probably some combination of the Middle East, and it's NVIDIA, right? And so now how do you bridge from today, where the investments are being made and you see the green shoots of this economic activity and how it's going to change the world, to where the actual commercial activity can then support the payment of it? And I think we have 6 or 7 different timing problems that we're struggling with, but that's what you're seeing from NVIDIA, is they're stepping in, trying to use their balance sheet to help bridge from where we are, investment in the infrastructure, to where we're going to be, extracting value from that infrastructure over the next 50 years, changing the world.
Good. Okay. This is fascinating, and we're going to run out of time, and I want us to pivot into energy. Because one of the biggest bottlenecks in building these football-size computers is how you power them. And that has implications both on climate, but access to renewables and nuclear and geothermal, and and even where you can locate these data centers. You want to talk a little bit about your thinking about that?
Sure. A couple of things. When we started building infrastructure, we used the NFL city approach, right? Like, those are where the population centers are. If we're going to build the infrastructure, let's build it in a low latency configuration to the population centers. Made perfect sense. Then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and suddenly you're changing where you're locating these things, not by population centers, but by where is the infrastructure to do this. So I'm going to say a couple of things. I would argue that our company's got a pretty sophisticated lens to look at energy. We ran, hedge funds on commodities, and that's how we look at this stuff. Couple of statements about the U.S. energy grid, and I'm going to keep it to the U.S. because different countries have different problems. But there's a lot more elasticity in the U.S. grid than people give it credit for. And those, there are pockets of power that are not being used. There are uses for power that there's more utility to it, right? So like a great example of that was we pioneered hey, let's go buy out these miners that are mining Bitcoin because that's really dumb. Take those megawatts that are incredibly valuable and repurpose them into gigantic scale AI, right? And I'm in the middle of my personal hell with Core Scientific is if you guys follow the company at all, you'll see them pop up as just generally a headache for me. But in any case, there's a lot that can be done, right? Like when you think about power, which is a real-time commodity, you build to the peak load, right? And those peaks occur, 3 days a year when it's 95 degrees and the sun's burning down, and but like I just think that like you can build 25% more data center capacity by simply having the government enforce interruptibility into some of these models. That's it. That's how you have to build it. And once that is there, we will be able to extend how much infrastructure we build, where we build it, all these kind of things, which are generally surrounding the concept of increasing capacity factors on the grid itself. So that's energy stuff. I think there's lots of really great stuff that can be done.
So you can configure your data center, basically, to be able to operate when there is available power that is not necessarily being consumed by the households and the like, because you can work when people are sleeping and when you're right. Is that what you're saying?
A little bit. So like when you think of a data center, right, like a GPU data center, right, AI factory, whatever it is, there's different pieces of it. And we all just kind of think, oh, that's 100 megawatts, but that's not really how it works, right? Like when you dig in, there are pieces of the infrastructure that are critical, that cannot go down, right? And there's backup generation, and it's the way we all think about or have thought about data centers historically, right? Which is, 5 nines of availability and all this other stuff. But then there's the GPU, which, it's just an engine, right? Like you can turn it on and turn it off. As long as you protect the core, you can shave load. You can do all kinds of great stuff, right? And like, once again, what we try to do like occasionally we come up with good ideas. Most of the time we take good ideas that other people have come up with, because there's a lot more of them than us, and try to apply them to the problem that we have. And there's a lot that can be done. There's a lot of ways to extend the capacity, which from a national security perspective, I think is really important, because it is going to be harder for the US to build energy infrastructure. I don't care who's president or what they say, it's hard.
Yeah.
And so optimizing, maximizing, that's really important stuff, right? And I just think that like people are starting to think about it that way. People who are the consumers of this stuff are thinking about the way regulators are starting to think about it that way. The financial institutions are being educated to think about it that way. I think there's progress being made there.
And that has also ramification on architecting and building the software around it
Yeah.
so that you can basically work
Yeah.
with variable.
I love using software to solve real physical problems. Like I just think it's an incredible efficiency step function if you can do that. I didn't talk about the renewable stuff and all that. And I just like it's just, you know, it's the same problem as the energy companies face. You're building incredibly long-lasting infrastructure. You have to be really thoughtful about what the world looks like today and what it's going to look like in 10 years. And when you get there, then it leads you to making decisions to the best of your ability to be able to run this infrastructure on sustainable energy.
So I want to ask you one last question, and then are we going to have time for questions from the audience? No? Okay. So I take the last question as well. So I want you to